Good afternoon, everybody. Today I'm delighted to introduce Erica Monkwitz. Erica has just published Women, Horse Sports and Liberation, Equestrianism and Britain from the 18th to the 20th centuries. This is a full-length examination of women's involvement in equestrian sports over 200 to 300 years and explores the emancipation of women through sport, but not further through emancipation in politics. This is the 25th lecture in our series of online talks dealing with various aspects of sporting art. Again, I would like to thank Jamie Rountree of the Rountree Tryon Gallery for sponsoring this series. As I've said before, we're extremely grateful to Jamie, and it means that we can continue to put on these talks for free. It also means that non-members and, more importantly, future members can join us. Again, we're recording this talk for future reference. I would also like to remind you that you can access previous talks through the BSAT website. Erica is professorial lecturer in modern British and European history at the American University in Washington, DC, from where she's talking today. Her research focuses on gender, sport and empire in modern Britain, and specifically on women's involvement in equestrianism. Her work has led to awards. In 2016, she received the Junior / Early Career Scholar Award from the European Committee of Sports History, and followed that up in 2018 with the Solidarity Prize for Excellence in Early Career Equine Research. And she's just told me that in 2022, she was shortlisted for the Aberdare Prize for Sports History from the British History of Sport Association. As usual, Erica is happy to answer questions at the end of her talk. The procedure is that you use the Q&A button to the bottom right of your screen. You type in the questions and I put the questions to Erica at the end of her talk. So with no more ado, over to Erica. Thank you, Erica.
Excellent. Thank you, Tim, for that lovely introduction. I am delighted to be here with you today from the United States, where it is bright and early in the morning. And as Tim said, the basis of my talk today is from my book, and it encompasses 13 years of research. So obviously I can't talk about it all in one go, but I would be delighted to make an appearance again on this program to discuss other aspects. And today I'm really happy to highlight the work of Lucy Kemp Welch, whose art is currently on show in Newmarket as part of this exhibition in her own voice. I was really lucky to see this exhibition in Bournemouth, and I can tell you that it is absolutely unmissable. And Tim has confirmed that a new piece of art has joined the exhibition in Newmarket. And this is the extraordinary work from 1917, Forward the Guns, which is a masterpiece of 5 feet by 10 feet. So make sure that you get a chance to go and visit it in person. The title of my talk today is about the history of women and horse sports. And my goal today is to end the myth that women only rode astride because of the First World War. In fact, that is untrue, and I'm going to spend the majority of my talk today showing you why that is not the case. I'm going to break my talk into 4 parts so you can follow along. First, I'll talk about the evolution of the side saddle. Second, I'll look at how women joined fox hunting fields and how riding clothing changed. Third, I'm going to look at the influence of the British Empire and why women abandoned the side saddle. And fourth, I'm going to look at women's work in the First World War as relating to horses and highlight some of Lucy's best works, in my opinion. So, without further ado, as Tim said, we'll start at the beginning. Many people are surprised that women didn't always ride side saddle in Britain. In fact, until the 14th century, women rode astride like men for ease of transport or for sports like hawking or hunting. They likely rode on a modified knight's saddle, which you can see in these illustrations, It has a high pommel and a high cantle, and probably with very similar clothing. This all changed in the 1380s. And that is when Anne of Bohemia, wife of Richard II, is credited with bringing a new continental style of riding sideways to the island. And with it, a new ideal of aristocratic femininity. And as you can see here, these saddles were basically pack saddles that put a woman literally sideways on the horse. And they're not a very secure conveyance at all. They have a seatbelt and they have a footrest, and they put you on top of a horse completely perpendicular. By the 15th century, the side saddle had become the only appropriate way for women to ride. In accordance with social strictures regarding respectable femininity and Catholic teachings about feminine modesty and chastity, a woman's legs now had to be kept clothed and properly covered. There would be no more riding astraddle. So in the Canterbury Tales, as you see here, the wife of Bath is clearly flaunting convention by riding astride and by wearing her spurs sharp, a very masculine accessory. Eventually, a single pommel gets added to the front of the saddle, but still, such tack is far from safe or secure. Riding for women is still for show, not sport, and I'm indebted to Sally Mitchell, who I know is on the Zoom, for the image here, which you can see of Lady Louisa Connolly's horse and groom. And yes, the stirrup is attached simply by a strap over the single pommel, so not very safe at all. At this time, the trajectories of female equestrianism in England and Europe began to diverge. And this is due to the larger evolution of warfare and recreation. The effective utilization of firearms and infantry had made heavy horse and armor obsolete. It led to the slow decline of knightly horsemanship and the mounted sports like the tournament and the joust. European cavalries therefore evolved for a new kind of war. European horses were still bred heavy, but were expected through expert training to be lighter and faster on their feet. The movements of the battlefield were therefore regulated and controlled through the strict training of classical dressage, known as haute école. But in contrast to France and European countries more generally, England and later Britain's relationship with cavalry and mounted warfare is very different. England is an island with natural defenses. It did not have a standing army until Cromwell, and then it rarely sent military expeditions to Europe. Training a cavalry for war was therefore less important in England than in Europe. And so riding developed for recreational purposes rather than military, for sport, not war. This means that a different kind of riding for racing and hunting had been encouraged and promoted in England at least since the 1500s. Fox hunting gained prominence as the British horse sport par excellence by the late 18th century. Traditional games such as the stag, the boar, and the wolf had been exhausted in Britain, though they had not been on the continent. So the chase turns to a new animal, the fox. This wily animal is considered vermin, and therefore it was not restricted to hunting under the game laws. And this proved popular because it means that the sport was opened for more than just the aristocracy. Once the fox is targeted as prey, however, hunting in Britain is forced to evolve. Foxes run fast and in straight long lines across what was, even by the mid-1700s, an enclosed countryside of grassland devoted to raising livestock and therefore prickling with fences, hedges, and other obstacles to be jumped. And one thing that always amazes my sport historian colleagues is when I point out fences like this, granted they are from the 1900s, but that an Olympic jumping maximum height is 5'3", and very clearly some of the fences out in the hunting field were far higher than that. And this is, of course, a positive proof that hunting is not entirely free from danger. To cope with these new demands, Eastern bloodstock was imported and bred with native horses, which led to the creation of the thoroughbred hunter and racer. We go from a chunky monkey horse down to a very thin-legged, fast, agile thoroughbred. It is this move away from heavier horses and haute école to hunting in Britain that opens new opportunities for female riders. First, it is not a military endeavor, and therefore, equestrian sport is not limited only to men. Hunting, as a more demanding sport with all of these fences and galloping, catalyzes a new development in tech for women. And this is the modern side saddle. And I'm going to take some time to show you how this saddle changes through the ages. So bear with me while I show you some pretty pictures. As you can see here, early side saddles had only 2 pommels. And that eventually changes by the 1830s through 1850s to get what we know today as the 3rd pommel, or leaping head. So to walk you through, in the 1760s, as we saw before in Sally Mitchell's awesome image, the 2-pommel side saddle had a stirrup attached by a strap over the single pommel. Often they had quilted seats with doe skin, but they certainly weren't what we might say a very safe conveyance. This evolves by the 1790s. This is one of my favorite images from Art Museum of Virginia Fine Arts from James Ward, where we get a full leather side saddle, still with 2 pommels and with a slipper stirrup, but obviously evolving with the new demands for women to ride. To give you a little bit of a bird's eye view of what it would have looked like or felt like to ride in this kind of side saddle, you can see the crutch or the U-shaped fork at the center of the saddle. A woman's leg would have gone through that, and that would have provided just about the only balance she would have had to stay upright and on top of her horse. So not exactly what we would have said stable or secure. And it's very easy to tell if a woman is riding in a 2-pommel side saddle when you look at sporting art, because they have a very crooked position, a leg position that shows that her leg is through the upper crutch and her other leg is dangling from the stirrup. So this one from the National Gallery clearly shows a woman riding in a 2-pommel side saddle. And Queen Victoria, our queen, actually never rode in a side saddle with a leaping head. She preferred a 2-pommel side saddle. The saddle seen here is in the Royal Collection Trust, but there is a second side saddle that was owned by Queen Victoria, which I have just discovered, and it is in Northampton. So I can always answer questions about that if you're interested. But you can see by pictures of Queen Victoria that she is also riding in that very different style, with one leg quite raised and the other leg quite low. This, of course, changes when you get the leaping head, and a woman's position changes dramatically so. The saddle is what changes everything. It gives stability, security, and safety to a woman on horseback at speed and over fences. The addition is so linked to changes in sport that the leaping head is called the hunting pommel. And it is no coincidence that these changes appear at the same time that women begin to flock back to hunting centers like Melton Mowbray. Now, along with changes in sport, in saddlery, come changes in sartorial dress. I'll give you an example of horses jumping, and now on to dress. Riding garments, called riding habits as we know, became specialized sporting items. In fact, they are the first specialized sporting clothing. And they always look different in images. You can tell very clearly what is a riding habit versus what is not. It lacks all the frills. What to wear for riding was always very difficult for women. First, the skirt had to fit over 2 protruding pommels. Second, the clothing had to withstand the rigors of physical activity. And third, those garments should provide safety and security on horseback. Should provide. what to wear became especially important when women joined fox hunting fields. It's no longer enough to look beautiful on a horse. Hunting demanded that riders execute skilled equitation. Habits had to withstand the demands of lengthy galloping and jumping, and also the challenges of the English landscape and climate. Fabric had to be tough enough to withstand mud and briars, and also waterproof and warm to protect from cold and rain during the hunting months of November to April. This is a lot to ask, and it made riding clothes look absolutely different than anything else women wore during the last 50 years of the 19th century. As you can see from this quote here from Samuel Sidney, when a young lady undertakes to ride in earnest, she must dispose of every article of her previous attire, except for stockings, and reclothe herself from head to foot. So completely different if you want to go riding. But even as saddles and clothing and riding styles advanced in the 19th century, side saddle riding is still very problematic. A side saddle and the associated clothing virtually locked a woman into place, and this meant that she could not be thrown clearly in case of a fall, as a man could. It meant that in a fall or coming down over a fence, horses often rolled on or over their riders. Many women were seriously injured, often with paralyzing injuries, and many died if accidents occurred. And the one image seen here of Emilie Lauzet, who was a French rider, the horse came over backwards with her, the top pommel went through her stomach, and she died of gangrene 3 days later. And that is not the only incident of that kind of accident happening. So terrifying accidents. In an attempt to fix this problem, the first safety skirts hit the market in an attempt to make the clothing safer for riding side saddle. The point is to have the skirt, or now the apron, disentangle from the saddle in case of an accident, and thus allowing a woman to fall free. However, many injuries and accidents still occurred, and they are littered in the hunting diaries and newspapers of the last century. At home in Britain, women wearing the breeches, and only wearing the breeches, is still considered unacceptable before 1900. And this is an interesting paradox, because if safety skirts came away in case of a fall, as was intended, a woman would be left stranded in only her breeches. However, for women, wearing only the breeches is not respectable. The change to make such clothing acceptable would have to come from elsewhere, and it did. And you can see from these two images here, clearly what is intended has happened. The skirt has come away, but a woman wearing just the breeches is still not okay. So riding and hunting in Britain were extremely popular in the late 1800s, and female equestrians are widely accepted and respected participants. But in the 60 years between 1838 and 1899, there were at least 35 riding guides published for women in Britain. And these are just riding manuals only for women. That's one every other year, and many of these went into several editions. For example, Nanny O'Donoghue's first book, this is her second here, Riding for Ladies, but her first book went through 5 separate editions. So that's a glut on the market. There are plenty of books out there. The thing is, all of these guides focus exclusively on side saddle riding. Not a single one mentioned that women might ride astride. But by the late 1800s, British women are already riding astride, and the practice is making rapid headway. So how does this happen? Well, at the same time that their sisters were proving themselves by hunting in the Midland Shires, other British women are demonstrating their mettle around the British Empire. Around the British Empire, there are far more opportunities for riding and far other events. These include polo, gymkhanas, paper chasing, and pig sticking. And pig sticking is exactly what it sounds like. It is chasing a wild boar on horseback at high speed and trying to skewer him with a spear. And yes, women were participants in that sport. All of these new possibilities are enthusiastically embraced by female riders, especially in British India. So then the question is, well, how is riding different in the empire, in India, for example, than in Britain, and why does this matter? Well, first, India provided more opportunities for horse ownership than in Britain. Horses were cheaper and far more available. Second, horses are far more necessary in the empire. They're not only used for sport and recreation, but they're also required for travel of almost any kind. Third, side saddles, being large and bulky, do not fit on small, narrow native ponies. They tend to go completely around and end up belly side down. Fourth, dress is also a factor. Women's riding clothes are made from heavy Melton wool cloth. This makes them unbearable in the tropical heat and prone to shrinking drastically in the first wash. Men's riding clothes were more durable, more comfortable, and cut from lighter cloth. Fifth, women's involvement in horse sports was absolutely vital and necessary around the empire in ways that it was not in Britain. To complete polo teams, for example. In India, many women trained their husbands' polo ponies, and this virtually required them to ride astride like men if the training is to be effective and the ponies competitive for the demanding military polo matches. Polo aside is fine in that it gives you one side in which to hit the ball, but it doesn't really give you many other opportunities. So you can see here, this is from Polo Bewitched. But obviously riding astride is much easier and far more effective if you want to train polo ponies or play polo yourself. And in fact, one woman who I really want to know more about, and if anyone knows anything, please contact me, is Noella Whitting, seen here, who was a polo player around the turn of the century. So an absolute incredible woman that I'd love to know more about. Beyond polo, though, riding astride is also better for traveling. Mrs. R.H. Tyack, an enthusiastic adventurer, endorsed the practice of riding astride in the 1890s, and she wrote, "Directly we left civilization and began camp life, I promptly discarded my champion and Wilton saddle and my busbine habit and took to riding cross-legged." Other women did the same. Traveling via horseback around 1900, Isabel Savory wrote, "The last thing a woman ought to have ridden on was a side saddle." And from this image from the graphic seen here, I sort of like to imagine that one of the women is riding cross saddle. The other woman is certainly riding side saddle. There's just certain straightness to the other position that I wonder if they meant to make sure she was riding astride. Probably not, but I like to imagine it. To ride astride effectively, however, women needed proper clothing. Leading firms in Britain, such as Guterbach, Coutts, Thomas, Montagu Smythe, Hart & Son, etc., all advertised astride habits by the turn of the century, and they advertised them in a specific way. For Indian and colonial wear, the astride habit for colonial wear. And by 1906, many were advertising that the ride astride habit had been adopted by every sensible woman. The benefits of riding this way in the British Empire were so great that many women encouraged the style be brought back and continued at home in Britain in the late 1890s and early 1900s. One of those women was Mrs. Stuart Menzies, who wrote the book Women in the Hunting Field in 1913. She called riding astride the safest style compared to riding side saddle, and she based her opinion on her experiences of riding both side saddle and cross saddle in India. And she is actually one of the first to include a picture of a woman's cross saddle and astride dress. Such sporting and sartorial advances were very appealing to women riding in Britain. Imperial sports had been brought back home and encouraged the continuation of riding astride. Polo, gymkhana games, even pig sticking, except the pig now becomes a balloon. And as an American, I feel very slighted that we never had this kind of gymkhana game in America. I would have loved to have a pig that I could have used spear and tried to, stab. But sadly, we did not have this, although there are a lot of great images of this kind of gymkhana game in the newspapers of the time. And of course, you can see one of these is actually a cigarette card, which is quite tiny, but does show pig sticking at home in Britain. As women became interested in competing in horse shows, often for cash prizes, and being competitive in jumping competitions, many women realized that they would need to ride astride if they wanted to win more classes. You can see here the difference between high jumping side saddle and high jumping cross saddle. I'm quite an adventurer myself. I'm still not sure I want to try this side saddle. Women were also taking over new duties for fox hunting. And this included becoming masters of hounds. And only riding astride allowed them to complete these duties fully. Mrs. Hughes of the Nath Bower is one of them, and she writes that she turned to riding astride because she was a master of hounds and because it was the only way that allowed her to complete her duties most fully. In places where hunting was conducted over difficult terrain, such as Exmoor, many women turned to riding astride for their own safety and comfort, as well as their horses. Before the war, advertisements illustrated the latest style in astride habits, and these are habits that are not meant for riding in the Empire, but for riding at home in Britain. Ross's Astride Exmoor hunting coat and skirt says it all, and I'm delighted to show I've just acquired this next image, seen here, from 1904, which clearly shows a woman in an astride habit out with the staghounds. So that's a new addition to my collection. So here's where I can make the point that it is only because the astride style of riding had become so popular in Britain before the outbreak of war in August 1914 that women were so able to greatly assist in equestrian-related war efforts. And here we go with one of Lucy's greatest works. Women might not be able to serve on the front lines, but they did serve in many important roles elsewhere. And one is training, rehabilitating, and conditioning horses for the military. So let me give you some background on remount depots, their founding, and their purpose. In 1887, the remount section was established within the Army, replacing the earlier responsibility for each regiment to provide its own animals. Remount depots were to provide fresh, healthy, and trained horses, donkeys, and mules for Army use in both peace and war. But acquiring and training horses for the Boer War had been an absolute disaster. About 75% of the horses had been labeled bad or unfit. That means that when August 1914 rolled around, they were still arguing about the best way to get horses into the military, and nothing had been decided. And in fact, many people thought horses wouldn't be needed for the next conflict at all, except we know that isn't true. And really quickly, before I go to my next slide, I am also a very proud owner of this leather stamping die, which shows very clearly that ladies and women were clearly involved in remount work. Horses would definitely still be required in the First World War, and a lot of them. High-quality hunting horses were wanted for use by officers, draft horses were needed to pull wagons and guns, and even mules and ponies were needed to carry other loads. The Army Remount Corps located, trained, and recuperated over 340,000 horses during the course of the war. And to put that into perspective, in 1914, the Army possessed about 25,000 horses. By 1917, they possessed almost 1 million. So over a third of the horses that went through the remount depot were part of the total for World War I. Remount depots were set up across the country. We can see a few of the Kemp Welch artworks here. They acted as collecting points for horses from farms, businesses, and hunts. As the war continued, however, remount depots became about more than just accumulating horses and shipping them out. They were transformed into convalescent homes for sick and injured horses in order to be made fit for service again. Some depots specialized in healing horses which had been suspended from duty because they had been deemed incurably vicious. One of the major figures in this process was the sporting artist Cecil Alden. He initially became a remount purchasing officer, responsible for buying horses for military purposes, and it was a role for which he was uniquely suited to, having contacts in the hunting world. There was a major problem, however. Not all horses gathered were in their prime, and it became very clear that many of them needed additional care and conditioning, and often breaking in, before they could be used by the military. So Alden decided to do something revolutionary. His wife and daughter were already helping out at the Purley Remount Depot with the cleaning and feeding of horses. And in case you're interested, there was also an artist there with them named Munnings, so someone really important. But most of the hunt staff were away with the war, and this left the brunt of the work just to them. When Alden tried to recruit local infantrymen, they knew almost nothing about horses and were not young or fit enough anyway. And so I include this Punch cartoon. There are several that are humors of a remount depot, with the commanding officer asking, "Didn't you have anything to do with animals before you joined?" And the clearly scared man saying, "Yes, I was a lion tamer," thus showing you the mettle of some of the horses that would show up in these remount depots. What Alden realized, however, is that if there was a lack of men, there was certainly not a lack of women, nor any lack of experienced horsewomen. He was the first to employ women at remount depots in 1915 with incredibly successful results. As he recalled in his autobiography, cleverly titled "Time I Was Dead," at first, the women had only quiet R2s, small riding horses, under their charge. But as time went on, and their horses were often better done and more quickly made fit for issue, more and more of my depots were placed entirely under woman control. After the first few months of this organization, I had more applications from hunting women for work than I could find places for. I had very few failures, no instances of slacking overwork, or the stables, and my difficulty and the difficulty of my head women being chiefly to watch that their strappers did not overwork and make themselves ill. Strappers was the common word for groom, descending from the old practice of strapping a horse to clean him. But in the context of World War I, it was also applied to working women, as specifically the opposite of a slacker. This was a term used to describe men who shirked their war efforts. And as we horse people know, life with them is not easy, and life at the depots was certainly not easy. All the stable work and exercise was done by women. The hours were 7 a.m. to 6:30 p.m., and initially about 40 to 50 hunting women were employed, with a head woman who oversaw each depot, and about 500 horses under the care, looked after by then a team of about 100 women. These women were called lads, after the masculine stable lads. Alden and many others were impressed by his female army of workers. Despite being described as slight little things, they would walk a mile or two to the nearest railway station, gather up 40 or 50 gun horses, and bring them back to the depot tied 4 or 5 abreast. The women had to be tough. Headwoman Eleanor Horrocks was injured by the horses on at least 2 occasions. Once she was kicked in the head, and once when she was crushed against the side of a stall. The Queen's lady-in-waiting, the Countess Verley, lost her daughter to an accident that occurred while doing remount work. As it was noted, one's nerves needed to be made of iron. And as you can see from some of the mules and horses in these photos, certainly iron indeed. One of the most famous depots run by women was Risley Park. This was established in 1916 by Lady Mabel Birkbeck, the wife of Major General Sir William Henry Birkbeck, who was director of remounts from 1912 to 1920. It had a capacity for over 100 animals and actually received 365 during the course of the war, producing 308 that proved suitable for Army use. This depot concentrated on horses belonging to officers and once retrained, they were quickly sent back to the front. And this is where Lucy Kemp Welch comes in, as she painted the remount girls at this particular depot. Her most favorite painting, or my most favorite painting, possibly one of her most famous paintings, is the straw ride. And here you see 3 women exercising the horses in the remount depot at an indoor straw ride, where each woman rides one horse and leads another. This is currently in the collections of the Imperial War Museum, but I think in the last year or so, the preliminary sketch came up for auction, and I was devastated that I couldn't put this in my personal collection. But if anyone knows who purchased it, I would love to see it with my own eyes in person. And just to show you some of the differences between the preliminary sketch and her final work, we'll go team by team. Actually, this is the framed version of the sketch. And here we go. Apologies for the Imperial War Museum's very dark image of their painting. But we can see on the one side, this is the first team. And in the sketch, there actually was planned to be a horse behind them, but that doesn't actually show up in the final version. And the horses are a little bit darker in the final version than in the sketch. We have a bright chestnut in the sketch and sort of darker bays in the final. The center 2 seem to stay almost the same in terms of movement, although the head girl changes, especially the color of her kerchief, from blue in the sketch to red in the final, with a more forward position in the sketch and then a more straight position in the final. And finally, our last team to the side. In the sketch, the gray horse is much more static, and in the final version, you see him kicking out at a gallop as he moves forward, with the head girl controlling both. So I dearly love this painting and its sketch very much. The women who worked at the remount depots were important not just for what they did, but how they did it. And specifically, I mean what they wore. Women training remount horses for the British Army necessarily rode astride. At the depots, it was noted, no side saddles are allowed. This meant women had to wear the breeches, if not yet safety helmets. Colonial habits provided the perfect template. And you can see here, women are wearing puttees in this image. And many habit makers actually advertised their ability to make astride habits for remount work based on their ability to make colonial habits. In 1916, Montague Smythe advertised, for the patriotic women who are helping to train remounts, Montague Smythe has designed some completely perfect riding kit. With his long experience in making ride astride clothes for the colonial women, he is naturally just the man to know what the remount trainer needs. After the war, the astride style of riding only continued to gain popularity for women, including a young Princess Elizabeth. In fact, many tailors actually stopped making clothing for side saddle riding, seen here in this advertisement. And in 1957, the last side saddle maker in London closed its doors. The astride style of riding proved so popular that Elizabeth actually never rode side saddle until she was asked to serve in Trooping the Color with her father in 1947. And of course, I had to include these pictures here. Today, equestrianism is one of the very few sports, and it is the only Olympic discipline where men and women compete against each other equally. Indeed, in 1956, Pat Smythe was the first female Olympian to win a medal in equestrian sports at the first Olympics when show jumping was open to female competitors. Most sports separate the sexes in competition, but for riding, it has been the other way around. It is this gender equality that traces its roots to the momentous shifts in women's riding and riding clothes at the turn of the century. Having achieved sporting parity through riding side saddle, women in Britain now achieved true sporting equality. Riding astride before the war made it possible for women to contribute so greatly during it and to continue riding so well afterwards. Women were finally wearing the breeches. And so I bid you a very fond thank you for listening to me today And I end with my little Kemp Welch, my chestnut horse exercising. So thank you very much for being part of this, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Erica. A quick spin through the whole history. I was lucky enough to go to the Museum of the Horse in Tuxford last week, and Sally Mitchell gave me a tour of all her side saddles, pointing out all the differences that had developed over the time. And for anybody who hasn't seen it, Sally's A Brief History of the Side Saddle is still on sale at the museum if you wanted to go into more detail.
And I highly encourage you to buy that book. It is absolutely amazing.
I agree. And there's so many saddles that Sally's been able to find and put in the collection and show all the differences, some of which you've picked up today. I also like the way that you've used and been able to use sporting art to show how changes in the sport and the involvement of women have taken place. We're often or a lot of people are dismissive of sporting art and see it as at the lowest rung of art. But it's obviously an extremely important source material for understanding all these developments. The one thing I want to start with, I was always told the men who were hunting in the 19th century were like, in their red coats, were like the Ferrari drivers of today. They were carefree. You see the pictures of almost destruction in Melton Mowbray on high jinks. I just wondered, how did women take part in those sorts of hijinks, or were they separate?
Absolutely. So there's definitely a chronology here, which is women and men join the hunting fields in the late 1700s, almost on an equal basis. It's very aristocratic. And so without the many fences and without the many obstacles, women, even on two-pommeled side saddles, can certainly take part. It's when the hedges start growing higher and when the fences start getting more numerous that you don't want to be trying to jump a 5-foot fence in your two-pommel side saddle. And that really occurs around the turn of the 1800s. So hunting for men around the 1800s tends to become this free-for-all, or bedlam let loose, as it were, where you get painting the town red in Melton Mowbray, where men have a little bit too much to drink and go out afterwards. You get these great stories of riding bears to dinner. I have that great illustration in my book of a bear being ridden to dinner. You get horses being ridden upstairs to second floor rooms and then having to be hauled out. Just a little bit too much fun in some cases, perhaps. And of course, this is the period where women really aren't involved. So about 1795 to about 1820, they tend to fall out of participation. They aren't able to join because of their side saddle. And then by the 1830s, when you have the third head added, when you have that leaping head added, women can rejoin. And at the same time, you have this concerted effort to make hunting a better sport. There's a general prevailing feeling it's gone too far. You know, we've had a little bit too much punch. Now it's time to reel it back in, bring some civility back into the picture, make the focus on sport again, make the focus on hound work and hunting, not just about jumping and galloping. And so by the 1830s, that's when you see the women coming back into the picture, being able to ride again, that side saddle with the leaping head, giving them the ability to ride over fences and at speed, and the sport once again becoming far more equal. So certainly by the 1850s, you have a more equal participation again.
One of the things that struck me while you were talking, Erica, was you're talking about sport and hunting, but not about competitive sport, as I would understand it. I did pick up a women's race in about 1715, which was won by the vintner's daughter. And we know Mrs. Thornton won a race at York, riding side saddle against the champion jockey, Sam Buckle. when do we see women taking part in competitive sports more seriously, rather than those just one-off events?
Yeah, so the way I think about it is that fox hunting is an informal competition. It has unwritten rules and regulations, but nothing standardized or formal as we would think of as show jumping today or horse racing. You definitely mentioned Alicia Thornton, who in the early 1800s is racing particularly well. But immediately after that, women drop out of horse racing and they don't rejoin again in any great numbers until the 20th century, sadly. In fact, women start joining horse shows in the 1850s. I'm currently working on a project now to trace the history of riding mistresses or riding instructors. And they are some of the first competitors in some of the great horse shows that we know today in Britain to exhibit their wares, as it were, not just their experience, but also their horses. And there are certainly sexual overtones to that. So it's a very interesting time in the 1850s and 60s when women are participating in formal competitions. By the 1880s and 1890s, it opens up far more. Participation and competition become far more respectable and acceptable. And this is also because you get children involved. You get young girls who are being taught to ride astride from the very beginning instead of riding side saddle. And it is this new generation, this millennial generation, that takes over and really wants to do so much more in terms of what they can do on a horse. And so it's not just about horse shows and high jumping, it's also about point to points, steeplechasing, and show jumping at the turn of the century. So that by the time you lead into World War I, you've had this generation of experience at competition, which picks up afterwards. It's just that the Olympic Committee and the Europeans are very stuck on not including women in the international competitions. And so you do have great show jumpers, Lady Wright, Pat Smythe, who are well into competition, triumphing across the continent in the United States. And it takes until 1956 for the show jumping committee in the Olympics to say, okay, we'll allow women. They are allowed in dressage in 1952, but it takes a while for them to be allowed in three-day eventing until the 1960s.
Is the competition in the Empire, or India particularly, was that competitive equestrian sport, or was it just fun pig sticking and egg and spoon race that I saw?
Yeah, so it's a mix because you have gymkhanas, which are competitions. You know, there's certainly an order and a winner and a hierarchy to an egg and spoon race or to tilting at the ring. But polo is the real competition in the empire, where you are definitely on teams. You're definitely trying to win the match. And women are very much included because you can't have unequal teams. And so they are wanted for their skills and they're wanted for their expertise so that you can have these matches. And then you have their husbands or their brothers or their relatives saying, well, if you've trained this polo pony, then I'm going to use it as well. And then they're riding those ponies in matches too. So you sort of have a co-ed sharing of horses, as it were, and competitions around the empire.
Thank you for that. You started the lecture, this is slightly off the central idea that you had about the differences between Great Britain and the continent.
Yes.
And I've always been struck by the difference in the courts of the various European courts against England, and why Charles II, who supported horse racing, even though he'd been taught haute école riding by the Duke of Newcastle, and yet he pursues horse racing, whereas the other courts continue with haute école. And I just wondered whether you'd been able to tease out how those differences occurred or why they occurred.
So it does, I think, go back to the military nature of riding and what you need for a cavalry, what you need for protection, what you're using in terms of warfare. England didn't have the necessary requirements to send cavalry to many conflicts. And so horses could be used for recreation instead. And the problem in England is that you have a civil war in the 1640s where all of the aristocratic riders and their well-trained haute école horses are slaughtered. And so that's basically the end of haute école in England. because you just don't have the expertise either in horseflesh or in their riders. The Duke of Newcastle is a sole outstanding remnant of that training, where he's amazing and he's incredible, but he's virtually the only one left. And so what do people turn to if you're an equestrian? You turn to that new fun thing called fox hunting, or that new fun thing called horse racing, where you have more of a competitive nature. You can make money through gambling on horse racing, and instead you can also have a lot of fun if you go out fox hunting. So eau de colle seems to be very much on the decline after the 1600s, 1640s in England in ways that it just isn't on the continent. In fact, it really ramps up in France, in the German lands, across continental Europe by the 1700s, because they're still fighting conflicts and they're still using horses to do it. So all of those highly skilled movements are deemed necessary on a battlefield. The capriole, etc., kicking out at your enemies to protect your rider in ways that just England doesn't have. And so there definitely is a shift in the way that England's horsemanship goes one way, and you see that horsemanship in America, for example, as the mother in the country, in many of the British Commonwealth countries, in ways that you don't see it in Europe, because they've never had that ability for recreation.
I think that's interesting, because there's a series of races called Royal Plates, which were the king giving 100 guineas at a particular race meeting, which was one of the richest prizes at the time. And it's always been said that Charles II introduced it as a way of encouraging the carrying of heavy weights, 12 stone, over 4 miles, and the winner had to win at least 2 heats during the afternoon. So you were creating stout or breeding stouter horses. And yet it doesn't seem to be, I haven't found any record of Charles II actually doing that or saying that, or and I've begun to feel that more political reasons, the king wanting support around the country, was why he was supporting horse racing, rather than wanting to breed better cavalry horses, which is what the popular story is. And I just wondered whether I should continue to seek out, challenge that.
Well, I've actually found sporting artwork to be so useful in this for myself, where I look at the paintings in that time period and I see the very heavyweight horses like the Robert Bakewell horse very early on, and then shifting down into that very thin, narrow, agile thoroughbred, the George Stubbs thoroughbred, because they're using that horse for different purposes. And so sporting art to me has been an immense resource. And I know that historians sometimes put it at the bottom of their list, but for me, it's actually the top of my list, because it shows so many things that we wouldn't have access to in other ways. So I see the horses as moving on in a much lighter, quicker fashion.
You talked about Alden and his involvement with remounts, and you quickly threw in Munnings.
I did.
Have you studied more? Was there more involvement? I think Lionel Edwards was involved with remounts as well, wasn't he, at one time?
Yes,
the artists were quite involved with remounts during World War One.
Yeah, it's not just Lucy. You have Lionel Edwards, you have Alfred Munnings painting the Canadians. The Munnings Museum had that wonderful exhibition not too long ago on his war artwork, which was absolutely incredible. They're some of my best friends, so I love the folks at the Munnings Museum so much for supporting me as we move forward. And one thing that I had presented at the Munnings Museum talk that I did was how most of Munnings' artwork seemed to be focusing on side saddle riders, and he does an absolutely insanely beautiful job of depicting them. But actually in his autobiography, which I have behind me, the 3 volumes, he says, I wish I had painted more side saddle riders before the fashion died out, because how terrible it must have been for horses to carry that load. And that's a paraphrase, but he obviously realizes that it's not the best way to ride a horse, that you could ride them astride. And in fact, his wife, Violet, turns to riding astride much earlier than we think. She's an incredible show rider. She rides beautifully. She's depicted in all of those beautiful paintings. But there's actually a sketch that I love very much, and I had it in my presentation and I took it out, of her called The General. And if you look at it, it's only a 3/4 sketch, but it pretty much shows her riding astride in the 1930s. So I really like that. And thanks to Jenny and Bill at the Munnings Museum for letting that come to me with that information.
I hope they're watching.
I hope so.
They should be. I think that's we've run out of questions, but what's your next project?
So I will share this with you. So my next project is on the story of Alice Hayes, who wrote the Horsewoman Manual in 1893, and her husband Matthew Horace Hayes, who was an expert horseman himself. It will focus on their travels around the empire from South Africa to India to just about anywhere in the world, and how that they brought horse training to different places in the world and then brought that back to the UK. So it'll be a transnational history of horse breaking and horse taming with a lot of adventure and love thrown in as well.
I look forward to that. I've got most of their books. One of my favorites is but the one when they were in Russia. And
oh yes, it's
describing
incredible.
the jockeys and the trainers from England that were working in Russia in the late 19th century. And the names involved.
Absolutely. It's an incredible story. They travel throughout so much of the world. They make us look like slackers today. And I have no idea how they traveled so much in an age before airplanes, but absolutely amazing the miles that they put under their belts.
Well, I think the trains ran on time.
Hopefully they did, yes. But they did a lot of riding as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I look forward to that.
Thank you.
And we will invite you back for
Beautiful.
to
I
talk
would love
about
to
that.
rehear.
Good, thank you. I mentioned that just as an aside, I mentioned that we do record these talks for future reference, and you will be able to access this talk on through the BSAT website in the near future. Those of you who were with us in September maybe remember that we had some very technical glitches, and I'd like to apologize to Sally Mitchell for the inconvenience that we've caused. Sally's talk is not up yet on our website. We're working on it, and we hope to add it in the near future. So apologies to Sally. It's a talk well worth seeing, and I hope we can get it up as soon as possible. Our next talk is on the 14th of December, 2 o'clock, same time as today, when I will be in conversation with William Newton and about his work on equestrian sculpture and his career. So thank you, Erica, for your talk and for answering the questions. Erica is planning to come over to the UK in the early part of next year and hopes to visit the Lucy Kemp Welsh exhibition in the Muller Gallery at the museum. And I'm delighted that she showed Forward the Guns early in her talk, because it's one of the additional paintings that wasn't on show in Bournemouth, and it does dominate the Muller Gallery, and it's a fantastic picture to see. The exhibition, it gives me the opportunity to push that exhibition. It's on at the museum until early February. It's a must-see exhibition of, I think, an undervalued artist, and when you see all her work together, I think you can see the quality of her work and the justification for putting on that exhibition, and it's well worth the effort of going to Newmarket to see it. And I hope we see you in person when you come over and you do get the opportunity to go to Newmarket, Erica.
You'll see me as soon as possible.
Good, we look forward to that. So thank you, Erica. Thank you, everybody else, for joining us today. It's much appreciated, and we'll see you on the 14th of December. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.